In October 1962, the world stood on a knife's edge. Nuclear weapons were loaded, missiles were aimed, and the smallest error or misunderstanding could have started a chain reaction that would end life as most people knew it. Fear spread not just through governments and militaries, but into everyday lives. Families wondered if their cities would be next. Diplomats worked frantic hours, and leaders had to make choices with consequences that could last centuries. This terrifying episode, the Cuban Missile Crisis, tightened a chokehold of dread around the globe. And the story that follows explains how a series of bold, risky moves brought humanity closer to annihilation than at almost any other time in history, and how one moment of judgment changed everything. After the Second World War, two very different powers filled the vacuum. The United States pushed a system built on democratic elections and market economies, while the Soviet Union promoted a state-led communist model and sought to expand its influence across Europe and beyond. Those competing visions created deep suspicion. Each side saw the other not just as a rival, but as a threat to the way of life it defended. That distrust hardened into decades of political and military rivalry. Instead of direct warfare, both sides used diplomacy, intelligence, propaganda, and local conflicts as tools to gain advantage, producing an era now called the Cold War, a long, slow competition that shaped almost every corner of international life. Central to that rivalry was an arms race that kept getting more dangerous. Scientists had moved beyond the first atomic bombs to far more powerful thermonuclear weapons, and both countries poured enormous resources into building bigger, faster, deadlier arsenals. These were not ordinary weapons. A single warhead could vaporize whole neighborhoods, flatten city centers, and kill hundreds of thousands in an instant. The very existence of such weapons changed the rules of politics. Leaders had to think not only about winning battles, but about avoiding the total destruction of civilization. That grim logic produced a balance of terror. Both sides understood that a full-scale nuclear exchange would destroy them both. So they developed strategies and postures meant to deter attack even while they continued to expand their capabilities. The situation grew more dangerous in 1959 when Fidel Castro and his supporters overthrew Cuba's government. Castro's revolution severed long-standing ties with the United States and, over a short time, pushed Cuba into Moscow's orbit. For the American government, the result was alarming. For the first time since the Cold War began, a Soviet partner stood on an island less than 100 miles from the U.S. mainland. Cuba's tiny size belied its strategic shift. It suddenly mattered enormously. U.S. policymakers, worried that Havana could become a forward base for Soviet influence in the Western Hemisphere, and that any hostile action from the island would be far easier to launch than anything originating thousands of miles away. In 1962, the Soviet leadership made a move that would push superpower rivalry to the breaking point. Under Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet Union began secretly sending troops, missile parts, and the infrastructure needed to field medium and intermediate-range nuclear missiles to Cuba. These shipments crossed the Atlantic hidden among other cargo and guarded with great secrecy. Soviet engineers and soldiers worked on the island alongside Cuban forces, building launch sites and preparing the weapons for use. For Fidel Castro, the Soviet presence was a powerful deterrent against another U.S.-backed attempt to remove his government. For Moscow, the deployments were a bold gamble, intended to shift strategic advantage. The plan had a clear logic. The United States already kept nuclear missiles in places such as Turkey and Italy, within striking distance of the Soviet Union. Placing Soviet missiles in Cuba promised to even the balance and to threaten the continental United States in the same way U.S. missiles threatened Soviet territory. Unlike weapons kept thousands of miles away, missiles on Cuban soil could reach major American population centers in a matter of minutes. Cities that once felt safely beyond the reach of foreign fire suddenly faced the possibility of near-instant devastation. The comfortable buffer created by oceans and distance evaporated. And with it went a large part of the psychological security many Americans had assumed was permanent. The Soviet shipments might have remained hidden for longer, if not for meticulous American surveillance. On October 14, 1962, a U-2 reconnaissance flight over Cuba photographed what analysts later identified as missile launch pads, transport erectors, and other unmistakable signs of a missile program under construction. The images were clear and damning, showing equipment and personnel that left little room for doubt. When those photographs were shown to President John F. Kennedy and his closest advisors, the reaction in Washington was immediate and intense. There was shock at the speed and stealth of the Soviet operation, and a sudden, chilling awareness that the most destructive weapons humankind had invented were now only a short flight from American cities. The discovery turned a tense rivalry into a crisis, with the real possibility of catastrophic consequences. Faced with that evidence, Kennedy found himself at the center of an agonizing decision. He brought together his most trusted advisors to form an executive committee, and for days they debated options in a high-pressure, fast-moving environment. Some advocated the most forceful response, a swift air campaign to destroy the missile sites, followed by a ground invasion to remove Soviet and Cuban forces from the island. They argued that decisive action would eliminate the threat quickly and demonstrate American resolve. Others warned that attacking would almost certainly trigger a Soviet response, possibly in Europe, and that such an escalation could spiral beyond control into nuclear war. There were also concerns about how the American public and allies would react, how Khrushchev might interpret any action, and how to avoid being trapped into a series of steps that could not be reversed. Kennedy listened to every point, weighed the military, diplomatic, and moral consequences, and understood that whatever path he chose would be judged by history and might determine the survival or destruction of millions. In the end, Kennedy chose a path that was firm but careful, refusing both panic and reckless force. He announced a naval quarantine around Cuba, deliberately using that word instead of blockade to avoid the legal and political language of outright war. American warships took positions in the Atlantic and the Caribbean, ready to stop and board any ships that looked like they were carrying offensive weapons to the island. At the same time, U.S. bombers were placed on continuous alert with nuclear warheads loaded and ready, while thousands of troops and Marines were rushed to bases in Florida and elsewhere, prepared to stage an invasion if diplomacy failed. The message sent to Moscow was unmistakable. The United States would not tolerate missiles aimed at its cities, but it still preferred to solve the crisis without the explosion of open combat. The mood around the world became tense and tightly wound. People who had never before thought much about war now felt its shadow directly. Newsrooms were full of urgent broadcasts and stark headlines, and ordinary families quietly began to prepare for an uncertain future by storing food, water, and basic supplies. The sense that disaster might come at any moment touched private lives and public places alike. Schools, workplaces, and churches all felt the pressure of a crisis that could change everything. Military leaders in Washington argued for more forceful measures, pressing for airstrikes and invasion plans on the grounds that speed and surprise would remove the threat. Kennedy listened to those voices, but resisted moving the country to immediate attack. He understood that a single military strike could trigger retaliation from the Soviet Union and escalate into a conflict no one could control. During those fraught days, the world's nuclear forces were kept on a razor's edge. The United States raised its alert status to DEFCON 2, the highest level ever reached in its history, signaling that nuclear war was a real and present possibility. Strategic Air Command kept bombers armed with hydrogen bombs in the air or on the tarmac with crews on immediate standby. At sea, Soviet submarines equipped with nuclear weapons operated dangerously close to American ships, enforcing the quarantine. In one of the most frightening moments, U.S. destroyers dropped depth charges to force a submerged Soviet vessel to surface. The submarine's crew believed they were under attack and considered responding with a nuclear torpedo. Had that weapon been launched, a single act of desperation, every hour of the standoff felt like a test of will and judgment. Armed forces were in place, and political pressure mounted from every direction. Minor mistakes, bad communications, or rash decisions could have unleashed catastrophe. The balance between military preparedness and political restraint was fragile. Too little show of force might be read as weakness, but too much force could shatter the fragile barrier holding back full-scale war. It became painfully clear that the difference between survival and destruction rested as much on patience, clear thinking, and restraint as on plans and weapons. As the days passed, both Kennedy and Khrushchev grew increasingly aware of how quickly the window for a safe resolution was closing. The missile sites in Cuba were being pushed toward readiness, and once fully operational, the range and speed of those weapons would greatly increase their danger. Kennedy demanded the removal of the missiles, Khrushchev, who believed the weapons defended Cuba and balanced American missiles in Europe and Asia, was reluctant to give them up without concessions. Their public statements often sounded firm and uncompromising. But privately, both leaders and their advisors explored ways to avoid an out-loud clash. Letters, back-channel messages, and secret diplomatic contacts moved between Washington and Moscow, allowing negotiators to test proposals away from the fevered glare of public opinion and the rhetoric of war. Inside the U.S. government, advisors continued to clash over the right course. Some argued that only a decisive military blow would stop the threat before the missile sites were completed. Others warned that any attack could trigger a wider war, possibly involving Europe and the Soviet nuclear arsenal. Kennedy weighed these opinions carefully, mindful that history would judge the outcome and that the lives of millions hung in the balance. He chose to keep the naval quarantine in place, to maintain the pressure without rushing into violence, and to give diplomacy every chance to work. Meanwhile, secret conversations sought a path that would let both sides claim a measure of victory while diffusing immediate danger. Through a tense mix of firmness and negotiation, both capitals began to feel the pull toward a solution. The crisis exposed how close the world had come to disaster, and how much the future depended on the temper of individual leaders and the small moments of restraint they could summon. What looked like a simple military standoff was, in truth, a test of judgment, courage, and the will to avoid a conflict that might have wiped out whole cities and altered the course of human history. The turning point arrived when Khrushchev sent two very different messages on the same day. One letter offered a way out, a quieter, more conciliatory proposal that hinted the Soviets would withdraw their missiles if the United States publicly guaranteed it would not invade Cuba. The other letter hardened the tone, adding a new demand, the removal of American missiles stationed in Turkey. Kennedy and his advisors understood immediately that answering the harsher note in kind could wreck any chance of a peaceful settlement. They chose instead to respond publicly only to the softer proposal while arranging, through secret channels, to meet the Turkish demand, quietly and later. The bargain they stitched together was fragile and carefully staged. On the surface, the resolution looked simple. Washington pledged not to invade Cuba, and Moscow announced it would dismantle the missile sites. Behind closed doors, an additional concession was arranged. The United States agreed to remove selected missiles from Turkey within months. That detail was kept out of public view, so U.S. leaders could avoid appearing to give in under pressure, while Khrushchev could present the withdrawal as a victory for Soviet deterrence. In the end, both leaders could claim success. But the real success was far more basic. Both sides stepped back from actions that might have triggered a global catastrophe. When the Soviet ships reversed course and technicians began dismantling the launchers, people around the world felt an enormous, almost palpable release of tension. Yet the relief did not erase what had happened. For nearly 2 weeks, bombers had been armed. Submarines lurked under the seas, and soldiers were poised to fight. The crisis made plain how very small the margin had become between caution and calamity. A single misread order, a panicked captain on a submarine, or a mistaken radio transmission could have turned diplomacy into disaster. The memory of those dangerous days remained burned into the minds of policymakers and ordinary citizens alike. After the immediate danger passed, life slowly returned to routine, but nothing was quite the same. Leaders on both sides knew they had narrowly avoided an outcome none of them truly wanted. For Kennedy, the episode confirmed the value of stubborn patience and the peril of giving in to military voices calling for instant force. For Khrushchev, it became a lesson in how risky, bold, strategic gambits could be when nuclear weapons were in play. Both men would face critics at home, but both had also shown that steadiness and willingness to bargain could avert the worst. The crisis left practical and long-lasting changes in its wake. Washington and Moscow moved to build better lines of communication, establishing a direct telephone link so leaders could speak quickly in future emergencies. That line, later called the hotline, was the simplest and most urgent product of the October showdown, a tool designed to prevent the fatal delays and misunderstandings that had brought the world so close to annihilation. In the bigger picture, the episode nudged both countries toward arms control conversations and agreements, intended to reduce the chance of accidental war. Beyond treaties and technology, the Cuban standoff altered public consciousness. Ordinary people who had once treated nuclear threats as abstract, Global politics now understood how immediate and personal those threats could be. Families stocked supplies, communities talked about survival plans, and a new awareness settled over public life. The realization that a handful of decisions in rooms far away could decide millions of lives. That awareness helped fuel movements for nuclear disarmament and a broader conversation about how nations should manage weapons powerful enough to end civilization. History remembers the Cuban Missile Crisis not only as a diplomatic victory but as a warning carved into time. The episode proved that the safest path is sometimes the one that requires the most restraint, the humility, to resist the impulse to strike first, even when the pressure to act seems overwhelming. It also showed how diplomacy, secrecy, and quiet compromise can succeed where loud force might fail. The lesson remains painfully relevant when stakes are existential. Courage is often the ability to step back rather than step forward. In the end, the Cuban Missile Crisis was more than just a clash between two superpowers. It was a stark reminder of how fragile peace truly is, and how the fate of millions can rest on the choices of just a few leaders. For 13 tense days in 1962, the world stood at the edge of destruction, and only restraint, patience, and difficult compromise pulled it back. The lessons of that moment still echo today, reminding us that pride and power must never outweigh the value of human survival. This is the legacy of the crisis, a warning from history about how close we once came to losing everything. If you want to uncover more untold and gripping stories from this turbulent era, stay with us here on Cold War Files, where history's most dangerous moments are brought back to life. Asterisk.